For more on how India's foreign policy might evolve after the polls, let's speak with Karthik Nachiappan, fellow with the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. Well, Karthik, thank you very much for joining us on the show this morning. I want to start by asking you about Narendra Modi's vow to push on with his agenda despite that drop in support for the BJP. Domestically, we know what this might mean, but tell us about how this may impact India's overall foreign policy.
Well, thank you so much for having me this morning. So I think India's core foreign policy interests and objectives will probably not change that much. And neither will the international context, the focus on key strategic partners like the US, Japan, Australia, the European Union, or the focus on using diplomacy to support India's growth and manage its security concerns. All of that will remain. Modi's foreign policy will probably be characterized by continuity, but also some momentum over the next few years. So as I mentioned, focus on major powers, retaining India's influence in the neighborhood, deepening India's global South leadership, strengthening other strategic partnerships in the Middle East and Southeast Asia, enhancing regional security in the Indo-Pacific, all while remaining a pivotal player, a key swing state on the global stage. I think what might change could be the space that Modi has domestically to deal with and manage foreign policy issues. His government has largely had a free rein in this space over the last 10 years, and that could potentially change. Coalition politics and pressures could affect the focus on external affairs and how India deals with different partnerships, but also crises going forward. So the domestic politics of foreign policy will become more interesting to watch over the next few years.
Okay, you've outlined a long list there. Let's break it down now. Let's focus on India's pivot to the east. Many Southeast Asian countries, they've been advocating for greater links with India, air connectivity, for example, but Indian stakeholders have been a bit reluctant. How much do you expect Delhi to engage with the Indo-Pacific and Southeast Asia specifically?
So the economy is a key issue. India is in the midst of negotiating several free trade agreements, largely with partners in the West. So I think trade and investment will get a lot of attention and space in Indian foreign policy going forward. And that could mean more in Southeast Asia. I think India's general weakness in Southeast Asia has been economically embedding itself within the region. For various reasons, it hasn't been able to do that effectively. Over the last few years, it's become an important and a key security partner and an actor in Southeast Asia. But it's the economic and the trade aspects which has been lacking. India is not part of the RCEP. It hasn't been able to connect to the regional value chains and economic structures that are key in Southeast Asia. So if India figures out and boosts its manufacturing in the short term over the last few years, there's some hope that I think there's more integration with Southeast Asia, mainland Southeast Asia. But besides that, there are other issues that I think that could be also worth focusing on. Issues like digital payments, fintech, infrastructure, the blue economy, climate finance. I think India will look to focus on all these issues to become much more of an important economic actor in Southeast Asia, but also to use that to advance its own economic growth and become the third largest economy by 2030, as what the Prime Minister has promised.
Karthik, I'm wondering how you see China and the United States reacting to a slightly weakened Narendra Modi. Is Beijing going to see this as an opportunity to position itself as the undisputed leader of the global South, which you just talked about? And or perhaps you might see Washington's overtures being better received now by India?
Well, I think China will continue to be the most important and consequential relationship for India in Asia. It needs to get China right. There's an ongoing rivalry between both countries since the 2020 crisis that hasn't ebbed yet. The Prime Minister did speak about China on the campaign trail and the importance of mending ties with China. And he underscored the need to address the military standoff across the line of actual control, to stabilize the relationship and India's own foreign policy. And this is also something that the foreign minister has said on numerous occasions. So there could be some moves with respect to China going forward. I think India is not going to back down from its core claims and objectives on the border, but there's some chance that it could look to initiate dialogue to address the standoff with China, because I don't see that happening from Beijing, given the power imbalance between both countries. But as I said, Mr. Modi's space for maneuver here will be limited if he has to do any kind of a deal on the line of actual control. But it is in both India and China's interest to not let any kind of other crisis emerge. I think there's a need for India to really manage the relationship with Beijing by setting up some guardrails and prevent what is now a competitive relationship from escalating into an outright feud without having to achieve a full reconciliation. Because as you mentioned, India is still a key partner to the United States in balancing China in Asia and in pushing back what the US sees as China's assertiveness and hostility in the South China Sea and in the Indo-Pacific. So a fair amount of competition would benefit India between India and China, but it has to look for ways to prevent that from escalating even further.
India is part of the Quad alliance and is set to host the summit this year. They're going to be responsible for setting the agenda for that important meeting. How big of a test is it going to be for India?
Well, I think the Quad is a really important cog in the Indo-Pacific security architecture. It's changed over the last few years, where it's become much more of a public goods provider. So it's focusing on issues like climate change, digital economy, cybersecurity, critical and emerging technologies. So thinking of ways in which the four Quad partners can come up with new projects, initiatives, and rules that could be beneficial for the entire region. The last few years, the Quad has been beset by domestic political issues, both within, you have elections that are happening in India now that have been the focus for the last few months. And even in the US, the domestic politics has become much more contentious and fraught. While all the four Quad partners are looking for new ways to engage China, that's Japan, Australia, and the United States, which has, I think, affected what the Quad has done over the last few years, particularly at the highest summit leader level. So when all the heads of government meet, which hasn't happened over the last year or two. So I think it's important that they get back to that this year and that India sets a dynamic agenda. But I think it'll be one that I mentioned largely focusing on the Quad's current focus on providing regional public goods in the Indo-Pacific.
Well, Karthik, just want to quickly pick up on the point you made about Modi being slightly constrained because of the local dynamics now. He depends on his coalition partners, namely the TDP and JDU. What do we know about their foreign policy positions?
Yeah, so I think this is an important question, and it remains to be seen how they affect and constrain the Modi government on foreign policy. So far, the TDP and the JDU don't have strong anti-Western sentiments, unlike some of the coalition partners of the previous Congress UPA government from 2004 to 2009, who were vocally anti-American in some of their stances. So I don't think they would oppose the India-US partnership and how far it's come over the last few years and the progress that would have to be made over the next few years. And these parties also don't attempt to have separate policies with respect to India's neighbors, so Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Maldives, Nepal. Again, unlike some of the other political parties in India's states with international borders like Tamil Nadu and West Bengal, and their parties who have really tried to affect India's foreign policy with respect to those states. So it remains to be seen, but so far they don't seem to have strong foreign policy sentiments that would affect or constrain the Modi government going forward.
We will leave it there for now. Thank you very much for your insights today, Karthik. Karthik Nachiappan, fellow with the Institute of South Asian Studies at NUS.